Think cattle drives through Indian Territory were all gunfights and battles. Think again. The real story is far more interesting and way more complicated than Hollywood ever showed you. Cowboys didn't just fight their way through. They negotiated, paid tolls, hired guides, and built business relationships with Native American tribes. Indian Territory, which covered most of present-day Oklahoma, was unavoidable for cattle drives heading north from Texas to Kansas railheads. Every major trail, the Chisholm Trail, the Shawnee Trail, the Great Western Trail, went straight through Native American land, and the tribes who lived there had every right to control who crossed and what they paid. The protection methods cowboys used in Indian Territory weren't about violence. They were about diplomacy, respect, and smart business. Let's start with the most important protection method that saved more lives than any gun ever did: paying tolls to avoid conflict. This was the primary way cowboys protected their herds in Indian Territory. It wasn't dramatic, but it worked. Trail bosses would negotiate with tribal leaders and pay for the right to cross their land. The tolls varied depending on the tribe, the size of the herd, and the negotiating skills of the trail boss. Some tribes charged a flat fee per head of cattle, usually 10 to 25 cents. Others would ask for a certain number of cattle from the herd, typically 10 to 25 head from a herd of 2,000. A trail boss's journal from 1871 describes paying a toll. Met with Cherokee leaders today. They control this section of the trail. Negotiated a toll of 15 cents per head for our herd of 1,800 cattle. Total cost $270. It's expensive, but it guarantees safe passage through their territory. Money well spent to avoid trouble. This wasn't extortion. This was legitimate payment for using someone else's land. The tribes had legal rights to the territory granted by treaties with the U.S. government. They were entitled to charge for grazing rights and passage, and the payment process was usually formal and organized. Trail bosses would meet with tribal representatives, often at designated crossing points. They'd negotiate the terms, agree on a price, and sometimes receive a written pass that allowed them to continue through the territory. A cowboy's memoir from 1873 describes the process. The trail boss rode ahead to meet with the Chickasaw Council. He was gone for half a day. When he came back, he had a paper signed by the tribal leaders. It said we could cross their land for a payment of 20 head of cattle. We cut out 20 of our poorest cattle and gave them over. The Chickasaw were satisfied, and we continued north without any problems. Some tribes became quite sophisticated in their toll collection. They'd set up official crossing points with representatives stationed there full-time. They'd keep records of which herds had paid and which hadn't. It was a well-organized business operation. The Cherokee Nation in particular ran an efficient toll system. They'd issue permits, collect fees, and even provide services like guides and information about trail conditions. It was essentially a government operation. Trail bosses learned quickly that paying the toll was far cheaper than fighting. A battle could cost lives, scatter the herd, and delay the drive for weeks. Paying a few $100s or a few dozen cattle was a bargain in comparison. A trail boss's advice from 1,875 states: always pay the toll. Don't argue, don't try to sneak through, don't make threats. The tribes have every right to charge for passage. Pay fairly, treat them with respect, and you'll have no trouble. I've made 15 drives through Indian Territory, and I've never had a violent encounter because I always pay what's asked. While paying tolls was the foundation of safe passage, another protection method made the journey even safer: hiring Native American guides. This was one of the smartest things a trail boss could do. Native guides knew the territory intimately. They knew where the water sources were, which routes were safest, where the best grazing could be found, and how to avoid trouble. They also served as translators and negotiators with other tribes. A trail boss's account from 1872 describes hiring a guide. At the edge of Cherokee territory, I hired a Cherokee man named John Ross to guide us through. He spoke English and Cherokee fluently. He knew every creek, every hill, every shortcut. He also negotiated our tolls with the various tribes we encountered. Best money I ever spent. He got us through in record time with no problems. The guides were usually paid $2 to $5 per day, significantly more than regular cowboys earned. But they were worth every penny. They could prevent costly mistakes and dangerous encounters. Guides would ride ahead of the herd, scouting the route and making contact with tribal authorities. They'd arrange meetings between the trail boss and tribal leaders. They'd explain the customs and expectations of each tribe the drive would encounter. A guide's presence also signaled to tribes that the trail boss was serious about following proper procedures. It showed respect for tribal authority and reduced suspicion. A Cowboys letter from 1876 mentions their guide. We have a Creek guide named William. He's been invaluable. He warned us about a tribal gathering ahead and suggested we wait a day before proceeding. We took his advice. Later we learned that if we'd pushed through, we might have been seen as disrespectful. William saved us from a potentially dangerous situation. Some guides worked the same trails for years, building relationships with multiple tribes. They became trusted intermediaries who could smooth over misunderstandings and facilitate negotiations. Another protection method was traveling in larger combined herds. When multiple trail bosses were heading north at the same time, they'd sometimes combine their herds for safety through the most dangerous sections of Indian Territory. A combined herd might include 5,000 to 10,000 cattle with 30 to 50 cowboys. This large group was intimidating enough to discourage attacks from renegade bands while still being manageable enough to control. A trail boss's journal from 1874 describes combining herds. Met 2 other trail bosses at the Red River. We agreed to combine our herds for the crossing through the Chickasaw and Choctaw territories. Together we have about 6,000 head and 35 men. The tribes will see we're a serious operation, and any troublemakers will think twice before attacking such a large group. The combined herds would travel together through the most dangerous areas, then separate once they reach safer territory. This cooperation among trail bosses was common and practical. The downside was that combined herds moved more slowly and required more coordination. But the safety benefits usually outweighed these inconveniences. One of the most important protection methods was simply respecting tribal boundaries and laws. Each tribe in Indian Territory had its own government laws and expectations. Cowboys who respected these had safe journeys. Those who didn't faced serious problems. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had particularly well-organized governments. They had written laws, court systems, and law enforcement. They expected visitors to follow their rules. A trail boss's notes from 1873 list the rules he had to follow. In Cherokee Territory, no hunting without permission, no cutting timber, stay on designated trails, pay all tolls, report to tribal authorities at crossing points. Violators will be arrested and fined. We followed every rule to the letter. Some rules seemed strange to cowboys but were important to the tribes. For example, some areas were off limits during certain seasons for religious or cultural reasons. Cowboys who ignored these restrictions could face serious consequences. A newspaper account from 1875 describes a conflict. A cattle drive attempted to cross through a sacred area during a tribal ceremony. The Cherokee authorities stopped them and demanded they take a different route. The trail boss argued and refused. The Cherokee impounded the entire herd until the trail boss paid a substantial fine and agreed to follow the proper route. Respecting tribal laws wasn't just about avoiding punishment. It was about building trust. Tribes were more likely to help cowboys who showed respect for their authority and customs. Another effective protection method was trading goods instead of fighting. When tribes asked for payment, trail bosses would sometimes offer trade goods in addition to or instead of cash or cattle. Coffee, tobacco, flour, sugar, and cloth were highly valued trade items. A trail boss who carried extra supplies could use them to negotiate better terms or smooth over problems. A trail boss's account from 1876 describes trading. The Seminole leaders asked for 25 head of cattle as toll. I offered them 15 head plus 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of tobacco, and 50 pounds of flour. They accepted. The trade goods cost me less than 10 additional cattle would have, and everyone was satisfied. Trading created goodwill beyond just the immediate transaction. It established the trail boss as someone willing to be generous and fair. This reputation could help on future drives. Some trail bosses would bring extra trade goods specifically for this purpose. They'd budget for it as part of the cost of crossing Indian territory. Cowboys also learned to offer small gifts when meeting tribal leaders. A pouch of tobacco, a bag of coffee, or a bottle of whiskey could start a negotiation on friendly terms. A cowboy's memoir from 1878 mentions gift giving. Our trail boss always carried a box of cigars for meeting with tribal leaders. He'd offer them around before starting any business discussion. It was a sign of respect and friendship. The leaders appreciated it, and our negotiations always went smoothly. While most protection methods focused on peaceful relations, cowboys still had to be prepared for trouble. Posting extra armed guards at night was standard practice in Indian Territory. The guard rotation would be increased from the usual 2 or 3 men to 4 or 5. These guards would be positioned around the herd with specific instructions to watch for any movement or suspicious activity. A trail boss's instructions from 1872 state, while in Indian Territory we'll have 5 men on guard duty at all times, 2 circling the herd, 2 stationed at opposite ends, and 1 near the chuck wagon. Guards will be armed with rifles and pistols. Any suspicious activity is to be reported immediately. The guards weren't there to start fights. They were there to provide early warning and deterrence. The presence of armed, alert guards discouraged opportunistic theft or attacks. Most nights passed without incident. But the guards had to stay vigilant because the one night they relaxed could be the night trouble came. A cowboy's account from 1875 describes a close call. I was on guard duty around 2 a.m. when I heard horses approaching. I fired a warning shot and shouted an alert. The other guards came running. The horses stopped and retreated. We never saw who it was, but they decided we weren't an easy target. Another important protection method was avoiding sacred or restricted areas. Tribes had specific locations that were off limits to outsiders for religious, cultural, or political reasons. These might include burial grounds, ceremonial sites, or areas reserved for tribal use. Cowboys who respected these restrictions avoided serious conflicts. Trail bosses would ask their guides or tribal representatives about restricted areas and plan their routes accordingly. Taking a longer route to avoid sacred ground was always preferable to creating a conflict. A trail boss's journal from 1874 describes rerouting. Our guide informed us that the direct route north passes through a Cherokee burial ground. He strongly advised taking an eastern route that adds 2 days to our journey. I agreed immediately. Disrespecting burial grounds would be unforgivable and could endanger not just our drive, but future drives as well. Some areas were restricted seasonally. For example, certain hunting grounds might be off limits during specific times of year. Cowboys who paid attention to these restrictions showed respect and avoided trouble. One of the most effective protection methods was sending scouts ahead to negotiate. Rather than arriving at tribal territory with the entire herd, trail bosses would ride ahead with 1 or 2 men to make contact with tribal authorities. This advance contact allowed the trail boss to negotiate terms, understand expectations, and arrange for safe passage before the herd arrived. It prevented misunderstandings and showed respect for tribal authority. A trail boss's account from 1873 describes advanced negotiation. 3 days before reaching Choctaw territory, I rode ahead with my segundo and our guide. We met with the Choctaw Council, explained our intentions, negotiated a toll, and received permission to cross. When the herd arrived, everything was already arranged. We passed through without delay. This method also gave the trail boss time to assess the situation. If the tribe seemed hostile or if there were unusual circumstances, he could adjust his plans before committing the herd. Sometimes the advanced scouts would learn about problems ahead, conflicts between tribes, disease outbreaks, or other hazards. This information allowed the trail boss to change routes or wait for better conditions. A Cowboys letter from 1877 mentions advanced scouting. Our trail boss rode ahead and learned that there was tension between two tribes in the area we planned to cross. He decided to wait a week for the situation to calm down. That delay probably saved us from getting caught in the middle of a conflict. Another subtle but important protection method was keeping weapons ready but hidden. Cowboys were always armed, but in Indian territory, they learned not to display their weapons aggressively. Rifles would be kept in saddle scabbards rather than carried openly. Pistols would be holstered rather than held. This showed that cowboys were prepared to defend themselves but weren't looking for a fight. A trail boss's advice from 1875 states, "When meeting with tribal leaders, keep your weapons holstered. Don't touch them, don't adjust them, don't draw attention to them. You want to appear respectful and peaceful, not threatening, but make sure your weapons are loaded and ready just in case." This balance between preparedness and non-aggression was crucial. Cowboys needed to be able to defend themselves if necessary, but they didn't want to provoke conflict by appearing hostile. When trouble did occur, it was often because cowboys had been too aggressive in displaying their weapons, making tribes feel threatened and defensive. Another protection method was camping in defensive positions. When choosing campsites in Indian territory, trail bosses would look for locations that could be defended if necessary. Ideal campsites had natural barriers like rivers or hills on one or more sides. They had clear sight lines so guards could see anyone approaching. And they had escape routes in case the camp needed to be abandoned quickly. A trail boss's notes from 1872 describe campsite selection. "Camp tonight with a creek on one side and a low hill on the other. The herd is between the creek and our camp. Anyone approaching will have to cross open ground where our guards can see them. It's not a fort, but it's defensible." The chuck wagon would be positioned strategically, often as a barrier or rallying point. Cowboys would sleep with their weapons nearby, ready to respond to any alarm. These defensive camps were rarely needed. Most nights were peaceful. But the preparation showed that cowboys were serious about security, which itself was a deterrent. In particularly dangerous areas, another protection method was moving quickly through hostile areas. Rather than taking their time and resting the herd, trail bosses would push through dangerous sections as fast as possible. This meant longer days, less rest, and more stress on the cattle and cowboys. But it reduced the time spent in danger and the opportunities for trouble to develop. A trail boss's journal from 1876 describes rapid movement. "We're in an area known for renegade activity. I've decided to push through without stopping. We'll drive the herd for 16 hours today instead of the usual 10. The men are tired and the cattle are stressed, but we'll be through this section by tomorrow night. Better to be tired than dead." This strategy was only used in specific situations. Most of the time, maintaining a steady, sustainable pace was better for the herd and the crew. But when necessary, speed was a valid protection method. One of the most important things cowboys learned was maintaining peaceful relations with the 5 civilized tribes. These tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, controlled most of Indian territory and had the most organized governments. These tribes had been forcibly relocated to Indian territory from the southeastern United States in the 1830s during the Trail of Tears. By the 1860s and 1870s, they had rebuilt their societies and established functioning governments. They had schools, newspapers, court systems, and law enforcement. They were more civilized in the European sense than many frontier towns. Cowboys who understood this and treated them with appropriate respect had the smoothest journeys. A trail boss's observations from 1874 describe the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee are as organized as any state government. They have written laws, elected officials, and a police force. Their capital at Tahlequah is more civilized than most Texas towns. Anyone who thinks they're dealing with savages is in for a rude awakening. These tribes generally welcomed cattle drives as a source of revenue. The tolls they collected helped fund their governments and services. As long as cowboys followed the rules and paid their fees, the tribes facilitated safe passage. Some tribal members even provided services to cattle drives, working as guides, selling supplies, or offering information. It was a mutually beneficial economic relationship. However, cowboys also had to deal with renegade bands. These were groups that operated outside tribal authority, both Native American and white outlaws. These renegades were the real danger in Indian territory. Renegade bands would attack cattle drives, steal cattle, and kill cowboys. They didn't follow tribal laws or respect negotiated agreements. They were criminals, pure and simple. A newspaper report from 1875 describes a renegade attack. A cattle drive was attacked by a mixed band of white outlaws and renegade Indians in the Creek Nation. The attackers killed 2 cowboys and stole approximately 100 head of cattle. Creek authorities pursued the renegades, but they escaped into rough country. Protection against renegades required different tactics than dealing with official tribal authorities. Cowboys had to be more vigilant, more defensive, and more willing to fight if necessary. The tribal governments often helped cowboys deal with renegades. They'd provide information about renegade activity, warn drives about dangerous areas, and sometimes even provide armed escorts through particularly dangerous sections. A trail boss's account from 1877 describes tribal assistance. The Chickasaw authorities warned us about a renegade band operating in the area. They offered to provide 3 of their police to escort us through the danger zone. We accepted. Gratefully, the renegades didn't attack, probably because they saw we had official protection. Another important protection method was understanding tribal politics and alliances. Indian territory wasn't a unified entity. It was home to multiple tribes with different governments, different interests, and sometimes conflicting relationships. Cowboys who understood these dynamics could navigate the territory more safely. They'd know which tribes were friendly with each other, which had conflicts, and how to avoid getting caught in the middle of tribal disputes. A trail boss's notes from 1873 show this understanding. The Creek and Cherokee are currently in a dispute over boundary lines. We'll cross Creek territory first, then Cherokee. We need to be careful not to appear to favor one side over the other. We'll pay our tolls fairly to both and avoid any political discussions. Some tribes had better relationships with white settlers than others. Some were more welcoming to cattle drives. Cowboys who knew these differences could plan their routes accordingly. Guides were invaluable for understanding these political complexities. They could explain the current state of relationships between tribes and advise on how to navigate sensitive situations. Finally, one of the most practical protection methods was learning basic native languages or sign language. Cowboys who could communicate directly with tribal members, even at a basic level, had significant advantages. Plain sign language was a common language used by many tribes for intertribal communication. Cowboys who learned it could communicate basic information without needing a translator. A cowboy's memoir from 1878 describes learning sign language. Our guide taught us basic signs, how to say friend, trade, water, cattle, and other useful words. It wasn't much, but it helped. When we met tribal members on the trail, we could communicate our peaceful intentions and basic needs. Some cowboys learned words and phrases in Cherokee, Choctaw, or other tribal languages. Even a few words showed respect and willingness to meet tribes on their own terms. A trail boss's advice from 1876 emphasizes communication. Learn at least a few words in the languages of the tribes you'll encounter. Learn how to say hello, thank you, and friend. It shows respect and makes negotiations easier. The tribes appreciate the effort, even if your pronunciation is terrible. The ability to communicate, even imperfectly, reduced misunderstandings and built trust. It showed that cowboys saw tribal members as people to communicate with, not obstacles to overcome. These protection methods, from paying tolls to learning languages, from hiring guides to respecting boundaries, show that the real story of cattle drives through Indian territory was far more complex than Hollywood gunfights. It was a story of negotiation, respect, and business relationships. Between cowboys and Native Americans, the vast majority of encounters were peaceful. Cowboys who approached Indian territory with respect, fair payment, and willingness to follow tribal laws had safe journeys. Those who tried to fight or cheat their way through faced serious problems. The next time you watch a Western movie showing cowboys fighting Indians, remember the real history. Cowboys and Native Americans in Indian territory were more often business partners than enemies, and the smartest cowboys knew that peace was always more profitable than war.